She didn't expect to be invisible, but that's exactly what happened the moment she crossed the threshold of first class. The polished smiles, the whispered glances, the deliberate neglect, they weren't mistakes. They were walls built to contain her, to silence her without a single word spoken. A quiet storm of prejudice swirled around her, disguised as routine, yet loaded with a weight meant to crush. But beneath the surface of this orchestrated erasure, something powerful waited. Something that would turn the tables and expose a secret capable of shaking the very foundations of the system she was trapped in. This is not just a story of discrimination. It's a story of revelation, resilience, and reckoning. If you're ready to uncover the truth behind the silence, hit like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. The real journey is just beginning. The glass doors of Gate C-47 slid open with a sterile hiss as the final boarding call echoed across the terminal. Travelers rushed forward in clusters, dragging roller bags and clutching coffees, their eyes darting toward the LED display flashing final call. Flight 1187 Washington, D.C. Yvette Monroe approached the gate alone, moving with quiet confidence, her posture upright, her step deliberate. Dressed in a navy wool coat and dark slacks, she looked like someone used to traveling, someone used to being composed under scrutiny. Her boarding pass was preloaded on her phone, her ID tucked precisely into a slim leather wallet. As she neared the gate agent, the woman behind the counter glanced up briefly, then did a double take. Her expression flickered, not surprise, not a smile, but something that lingered at the edges of discomfort. Yvette raised her phone politely. The screen glowed with her digital pass. The agent scanned it. The machine beeped. The screen paused. Then nothing. "Ma'am, could you step to the side for just a moment?" the agent asked, in a tone rehearsed for customer service but clipped at the edges. "It's just a quick cross-check." Yvette blinked once. Her lips remained in a neutral line, her expression unreadable. She stepped aside calmly, not saying a word. Behind her, a middle-aged couple with silver hair and matching luggage stepped forward. Their passes were scanned with effortless efficiency. A soft beep, a smile. "Enjoy your flight," the agent chimed. Yvette remained waiting, watching as 3 more passengers, all white, were waved through the jet bridge without pause. She kept her face composed, but inside, something deep and familiar twisted in her stomach. She didn't make a scene. She never did. She had long since learned that silence was not surrender, it was survival. The second gate agent approached the computer, glanced at the monitor, whispered something to the first, and looked directly at Yvette. Another few keystrokes. A glance. Then finally, a forced nod. "You're all set. Thank you for your patience," the agent said, handing back her phone with a tight smile. Yvette returned the nod and walked into the jet bridge. The metal corridor hummed beneath her heels. The air had the recycled chill of conditioned air and engine fumes. Her mind replayed the delay, not with outrage, but with clinical detachment, the way you catalog a pattern you've seen before. First-class passengers were already settled when she entered the cabin. She moved toward seat 3A. As she approached, her steps slowed. Something sat on her seat. A magazine. Its cover torn nearly in half. The glossy page featured a black woman, smiling, powerful, mid-speech at a podium. A headline above her head read, "Breaking Altitudes. The Black Women Redefining Aviation." The cover had been defaced. Red markers scrawled across the woman's eyes. The paper shredded along her jawline. The damage was fresh, deliberate, not carelessness, intent. Yvette stared for a moment, then calmly, wordlessly, she lifted the magazine and set it face down in the seat pocket. She lowered herself into the chair and adjusted her coat across her lap, folding it slowly, deliberately, smoothing the fabric as if ironing away the sting. She fastened her seatbelt. A flight attendant passed by with a tray of sparkling waters. She skipped Yvette's row entirely, moving to the passenger behind her and offering a drink with a bright, chirpy tone. The man next to Yvette received a second napkin tucked beneath his glass. She received nothing. Across the aisle, another attendant leaned toward a passenger and murmured something. The two looked over briefly, smirked, looked away. Yvette fixed her eyes on the back of the seat in front of her. She didn't speak. She didn't shift. The announcement for final boarding rang faintly in the background. A mother walked through with two small children, their backpacks bouncing as they passed. One of the children paused at Yvette's row, pointing at the window. "That's a big wing," he whispered. His mother gently pulled him forward without stopping, murmuring something under her breath, casting Yvette an apologetic glance as they disappeared into economy. She adjusted the position of her carry-on beneath the seat in front of her. The corners of her mouth didn't twitch. Her eyes remained dry. She wasn't surprised, but she was tired. Tired in a way that didn't show up in muscle or bone, but somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath the surface of the skin. The flight crew moved through their pre-flight checks with mechanical indifference. Yvette reached for the safety card in the seat back pocket, not because she needed it, but because doing something, anything, kept her hands from clenching. She examined the diagrams like a new passenger. 3 steps to slide deployment, oxygen masks, brace positions. None of it was new, none of it helpful, but it helped her breathe. The plane shuddered as it left the gate. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, something about turbulence and estimated arrival. Yvette didn't listen. She closed her eyes briefly, just long enough to reset. She opened them again as the plane turned onto the runway. Across the aisle, the flight attendants moved with polished precision, serving drinks, arranging hot towels with silver tongs, offering warm nuts in porcelain dishes to the rest of the cabin. They flowed like performers on a stage choreographed for comfort and class, except their performance skipped row 3A without a missed beat. Yvette watched as the man seated diagonally from her received his second drink and a soft blanket, while the woman behind her chuckled with a steward about her favorite Chardonnay. She hadn't even been offered water. Not until now. A different attendant, young, with hair tightly pinned and a smile that never touched her eyes, approached with a tray. Yvette looked up, hopeful perhaps that the pretense of professionalism would finally apply to her. A plastic cup, half full of water, was placed on her tray without a word. No napkin, no lemon slice, no lid. The attendant was already gone by the time Yvette reached for it. She paused. Floating between the wavering reflections on the surface of the water was a long, bright strand of hair, blonde, unmistakable, coiled slightly like a whisper of mockery, resting gently between 2 thin lemon wedges. It didn't move. It didn't sink. It sat there as if arranged, a deliberate blemish in an otherwise pristine glass. She looked around. No one else had received a drink like this. She turned the cup slowly, watching the hair swirl like a floating insult. Her throat was dry, but she didn't drink. She didn't even touch the cup again. Instead, she reached slowly for the tray latch and lowered it. It clicked into place with a hollow snap. Under the thin paper liner, white clean, folded precisely, something was off. The paper didn't lie flat. There was a second layer beneath it. She peeled it back carefully. Her fingers brushed soft tissue, the kind used in airline restrooms. Folded neatly, placed deliberately. She lifted it and turned it over. There, scrawled in faint gray pencil along the edge of the tissue, were 7 words, "Your class belongs at the back." The handwriting was narrow, controlled, almost neat. Not angry measured. Meant to be found. Meant for her. Her fingers didn't tremble. She folded the tissue again, slowly, and slid it into her coat pocket, pressing it flat between the lining and the wool. Her lips remained closed. The rest of the cabin moved on in cheerful ignorance. Someone laughed behind her. Glass clinked nearby. The curtains separating business class from first swayed faintly as another attendant passed through. Yvette leaned back and stared at the tray table. The water, still untouched, sat like a symbol of everything they refused to say out loud. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't random. It was methodical, orchestrated, and done with such polished grace that anyone watching wouldn't even notice. That was the point. Nothing here was loud. Nothing screamed. It didn't have to. The quiet exclusion was louder than shouting. She reached for the tray release, folded it up with a soft click, and sat back in her seat. Her fingers curled into the armrest. She inhaled once through her nose and released it slowly. She wasn't going to cry. She had left tears behind years ago, along with the expectation of being treated like everyone else. What hurt wasn't the water. It wasn't the tissue. It was how natural the whole thing felt to them, how casual their contempt was, how they could script cruelty into service and package hostility in hospitality, all without breaking their smiles. The man across the aisle requested another drink. The attendant responded instantly. Yvette pressed her call button. Once. Nothing happened. She waited. 10 seconds. 20. No one came. She pressed it again. A soft chime echoed overhead. Again, no response. 1 minute passed. 2. She didn't press a third time. The message was clear. They had seen it, chosen to ignore it. That was the entire mechanism. Her presence here wasn't a mistake. It was a threat, a disruption, and they were executing their response with brutal subtlety, undermining her through small, relentless acts of erasure. Not shouting, not confrontation, just the slow erosion of dignity through denial. Yvette closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. The engines murmured beneath her. The cabin lights dimmed slightly for dinner service. Silver carts rolled out with white linens and glass carafes. Aromas of warm rolls and chicken in cream sauce drifted into the air. Row by row, the attendants served with practiced grace, pausing to explain dishes, offer pairings, smile down at each passenger as if they were royalty. Yvette's row was passed again. Her menu never delivered. Her seat remained empty of tray or cutlery. The attendant who had given her the cup of water passed by again. Their eyes met briefly. There was no acknowledgement, no apology, only indifference, a practiced blankness. The more they smiled, the more cruelly invisible she became, and with each passing minute, their calculated acts pushed further into personal space, inching toward degradation with a careful rhythm that mimicked service. She kept her eyes forward, watching the curtain to the galley sway gently every time the attendants disappeared behind it. The dinner service continued without her. No one acknowledged that she hadn't eaten. The air had begun to cool. They had distributed blankets to passengers around her, all neatly folded in gray fabric. Yvette's seat remained bare, and when she shifted slightly, she noticed her foot brushed against nothing beneath the seat. Her amenity kit was missing. Not delayed, not misplaced. Removed. Vanished. A pair of attendants passed again. One of them, a brunette with a tight bun and sharp posture, carried a tray with mini toiletry kits and a bottle of lotion balanced near the edge. As she approached Yvette's row, her pace didn't change, but her hand suddenly tilted, and the small white bottle slipped from the tray, striking Yvette's thigh with a soft thud before bouncing to the floor. It burst open on impact, spraying thick streaks of white lotion across the front of her navy skirt, painting it in uneven lines like a sloppy insult. The attendant glanced down. Her mouth tightened as if suppressing a smirk. Then she continued walking without a word, leaving the mess behind. No apology, no napkin, no effort to retrieve the bottle. Yvette looked down at the splatter drying across her lap. Her hands hovered a moment, then lowered. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't reach for the call button. She simply folded her hands in her lap over the stains, her fingers stiff against the damp fabric. The passenger seated next to her, middle-aged, stocky, with pale skin and a gold watch, had remained quiet since takeoff. He wore khakis and a striped shirt and had spent most of the flight staring out the window or flipping through emails on his phone. Now, he shifted suddenly in his seat. Out of the corner of her eye, Yvette noticed a folded slip of paper between his fingers. Small and creased like it had been passed discreetly. He opened it and read silently. Then his eyes darted sideways toward her briefly. His posture changed. His body angled away. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled his backpack up from the floor and hugged it to his chest, clutching the zipper like a shield. Yvette didn't speak. She didn't move. But she knew. Whatever was on that note was meant to plant something. Not doubt in her, but fear in others. Her character wasn't just being erased now. It was being rewritten. She had seen this strategy before in boardrooms, in high-level interviews, in social circles where rumors were as potent as proof. The power of implication could be more destructive than a direct accusation. And here, inside this cabin, the crew had found a new tool, the silent whisper. The poisonous suggestion passed like a secret among those deemed worthy of inclusion. She didn't ask to see the note. She didn't demand it. That would only prove its intended effect. But her mind played through the possibilities. Something simple, something loaded, something believable enough to make the man beside her treat her like a threat. Minutes passed. The crew continued their rhythm. Her tray was never cleared. No drinks were offered. When another attendant moved past her aisle, he handed headphones to a passenger 2 rows down and paused to ask if he preferred jazz or classical for his in-flight selection. When he reached Yvette's row, his hand slipped over her seat entirely, reaching instead for the man next to her, whose headphones had already been delivered. The attendant gave a sheepish laugh, as if realizing the mistake, and turned away. Yvette leaned back into the headrest, her skirt still damp, her stomach still empty, her presence still ignored. As the lights in the cabin dimmed further, screens lit up one by one across the first-class section. Movies, shows, tranquil visuals meant to lull passengers into a peaceful journey. But Yvette's screen remained dark, unresponsive. She touched the corner of the screen. Nothing. A system issue? Unlikely. Another quiet exclusion? Absolutely. She pressed the service button again. This time, it blinked once, then went dead. Disabled. There was no longer a pretense. She had been cut out of the system itself. And yet, to any outside observer, it would appear as though she was simply tired, resting, perhaps uninterested in entertainment. The man beside her now wouldn't meet her gaze. He pretended to be asleep, headphones in, body turned away. The note remained tucked into his tray table, half concealed beneath a napkin. He hadn't thrown it away. No one threw those things away. They held onto them, even when they didn't believe them, just in case. The note passed to the man beside her remained hidden but heavy in the air between them. A silent pact he had made with someone he didn't know, at the expense of someone he refused to understand. Her screen stayed dark, her water remained untouched, and her presence continued to go unspoken. She had become an unwanted fixture, not a person, seated among polished leather and curated service that was choreographed to exclude her with surgical precision. The moments stretched, each one thick with a growing weight of coordinated disregard. Then it happened, a new tactic, a shift. Not just exclusion now, but movement, redirection. One of the flight attendants, the same woman who had passed her 3 times without eye contact, leaned slightly toward her without fully stopping. "Ms. Monroe," she said softly, not with deference, but with detached formality. "We need you to come with us for a moment. Just a quick check regarding your baggage in the lower compartment." Yvette's eyes narrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in calculation. She said nothing, just unbuckled her belt, rose with quiet composure, and followed. The passengers around her barely noticed. That was the beauty of subtlety. If it didn't look like an incident, it didn't need to be questioned. The crew member led her toward the rear galley and down a service stairwell she hadn't even known existed, descending into the dim underbelly of the aircraft. Down there, the space was cramped and metallic, lined with storage crates, emergency kits, and sealed hatches. It wasn't a place for passengers. It wasn't a place for anyone, really. The attendant gestured toward a narrow metal bench tucked against the wall. "Just wait here," she said curtly, before vanishing up the stairs and locking the hatch behind her with a soft, decisive click. Yvette sat. The bench was cold. The air smelled of coolant and old fabric. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, flickering every few seconds like a pulse that was just slightly out of rhythm. No one came. No bags were inspected. No voices filtered in. Just her, alone in a space built for function but never meant to be occupied. She glanced at the far wall, where a cargo net hung limp across rows of stacked bins labeled in white block lettering. The silence here was different, clinical, deliberate, as if the plane itself had decided to remove her from its narrative. She checked the time. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. No footsteps. No apology. No correction. At minute 12, the hatch finally creaked. A different attendant, male, short, stiff-backed, appeared at the top of the stairs. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't say a word. He just opened the door, stepped aside, and waited for her to return to her seat like nothing had happened. Yvette climbed the narrow stairwell with steady feet, her breathing controlled. The humiliation hadn't pierced her, but it had weighed her down, like walking through shallow water in heels. When she returned to row 3A, she stopped. Her seat was no longer empty. A young white woman in a pale sweater and yoga pants now sat comfortably in Yvette's chair, headphones in, sipping a soda, her shoes kicked off and feet tucked beneath her. Yvette stood there, unmoving. The woman didn't look up. A flight attendant emerged beside her, almost on cue. "We had a reassignment while you were away," she said lightly, not bothering to wait for a challenge. "It's temporary. You'll be seated just a few rows back for the remainder of the flight." She gestured toward the last row of business class, still premium, but positioned directly against the bulkhead, next to the lavatory. A downgrade dressed as necessity. Yvette's stare held for several seconds, her jaw tight, her eyes locked not on the woman in her seat, but on the crew who had placed her there. Then she moved. Not quickly, not defiantly, just forward, down the aisle, backward. Her new seat was narrower, the armrest sticky, the overhead bin above her full. She slid in without resistance, now surrounded by the sounds of passengers who didn't speak her language, didn't notice her quiet, or chose not to. The whirring of the lavatory fan, just inches behind her, added a low drone to the indignity. A plastic trash bin clanged open and shut every time someone tossed in paper towels. She adjusted her coat again. It had begun to wrinkle. And then came the final stroke. A man in a navy jacket approached from the front of the cabin. He was not in uniform, but something about his stride and the badge clipped inside his jacket suggested authority. His hair was neat, his shoes polished. He stopped beside her seat. "Ms. Monroe," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "I need to confirm your identity. Standard procedure." He held out a hand, not in greeting, but in expectation. His eyes scanned her face like a scanner reading a barcode. Yvette didn't blink. She reached into her coat and handed over her government ID without a word. He inspected it, nodded once, and made no move to return it. At that exact moment, another crew member appeared across the aisle with a tablet in hand. He angled it slightly, and Yvette heard the soft, unmistakable click of a camera shutter. The quiet removal, the photo, the shifting of her seat, the security check that masked as protocol. It all wove into a meticulous script written not with authority, but with disdain, with a contempt so rehearsed it passed for standard procedure. She hadn't said a word. She hadn't needed to. Her silence had become armor, a final defense against a system built to press her down without leaving a bruise. But even silence was no longer enough. As the flight continued its slow crawl across the midnight sky, Yvette finally stood from her seat, her muscles aching from stiffness and restraint. The lavatory light flickered a dull green just a few feet behind her. She stepped inside the small space, locking the door behind her. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and recycled oxygen. She stared into the mirror above the sink, her own eyes reflecting back at her, rimmed with exhaustion. She dabbed at her face with a damp paper towel, then adjusted the scarf around her neck. Everything in her posture spoke of restraint, a kind of practiced containment born from years of knowing that in spaces not made for her, her presence would always be policed. She flushed, washed her hands, and stepped back into the cabin. The moment she sat down, her hands reached instinctively for her blanket, the thin airline issue one folded on her seat before she had left. Gone. Her headphones, too, missing. She checked beneath the seat, the side pouch, the overhead bin. Nothing. They hadn't fallen. They hadn't slipped. They were simply gone. Removed. Erased. Her fingers paused at the seat's edge, and for a moment she just stared at the empty tray table in front of her, then slowly turned her gaze toward the aisle. An attendant passed by, pushing a beverage cart with quiet urgency. Yvette raised her hand. Not high, just enough to signal. The woman's eyes passed over her, blinked, and moved on. She didn't stop. She didn't even acknowledge the motion. Yvette waited until the cart moved farther down the aisle, then reached up to press the call button above her seat. A soft chime rang out overhead, followed by a blinking orange light. She waited. 1 minute passed. Then 2. No one came. Across the aisle, a man in a crisp blazer leaned slightly to press his own call button. Within 15 seconds, a flight attendant appeared at his side, smiling brightly, bending slightly to hear his request, nodding before vanishing into the galley to fulfill it. Yvette's light still blinked. She pressed the button again. Another chime. Another moment of stillness. Still no one came. Her eyes didn't leave the aisle this time. She watched every movement. Watched the attendant stop at row 7 to serve dessert. Watched them refill glasses of wine in row 8. Watched them skip row 9 entirely, where she sat, as though she existed inside a pocket of air no one could penetrate, or worse, no one was willing to acknowledge. She pressed the call button the 3rd time. Nothing. The light blinked twice, then went out. Disabled. Disengaged. Yvette lowered her hand slowly, curling her fingers back into her lap. The message had been delivered again, not in words, but in systems, in actions, in the deliberate removal of response. She had no blanket, no headphones, no entertainment, no service. Her original seat was gone. Her tray had never been cleared. Her presence had been routed out of the path of service altogether. It wasn't just about discomfort anymore, it was about visibility. They weren't just denying her the amenities of the flight, they were erasing every trace of her inclusion from the journey itself. Across the aisle, the man who had received prompt service leaned back, reclined, slipped a plush airline pillow behind his head, and closed his eyes in comfort. 2 rows down, a couple chuckled over a shared tablet screen, watching a romantic comedy with synchronized smiles. Behind her, someone flushed the restroom. The air pressure shifted slightly, and she felt the gentle sway of the aircraft as it adjusted altitude. Everything around her functioned as normal. The hostility didn't have to be loud. That was its brilliance. It was methodical, meticulous, quiet. It wore the face of process. If anyone had stopped to look, they might not have noticed anything unusual. But Yvette knew. She knew because she could feel it in her bones. The loneliness was designed. The silence was enforced. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to shield herself from the glare of irrelevance. Her body ached not from physical pain, but from the weight of endurance. She had never been the type to cause scenes, never the one to raise her voice or demand correction. That was never the way. But something inside her was beginning to bend in ways it hadn't before. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about how easily cruelty could hide behind policies, how erasure could be wrapped in politeness, and how entire systems could isolate a person so completely without raising suspicion. She had long moved past confusion, beyond frustration. There was now only recognition, an acute understanding that her isolation was not incidental, not accidental, not the result of random chance or clerical oversight. It was precise. It was designed, and it was escalating. The silence surrounding her had become its own language, a steady denial of her humanity spoken through avoidance, indifference, and selective service. The crew was executing their plan with such calculated fluency that it felt as if they had trained for this moment, as if they had rehearsed how to break a woman without ever raising their voices or drawing the attention of others. The passengers remained oblivious, lulled into comfort by warm towels and in-flight movies, unaware that an entire campaign of psychological warfare was unfolding just a few seats away. Somewhere near the front of the aircraft, a chime echoed from the intercom, followed by a crisp voice announcing that the flight crew would be distributing a special passenger experience survey, part of an airline initiative to improve first-class security protocols and passenger satisfaction. Yvette didn't look up. She had heard enough euphemisms for targeted scrutiny to recognize one when she heard it. Still, she waited, watched, observed as a flight attendant, holding a small stack of thick envelopes, moved gracefully from row to row at the front of the first-class cabin, placing one envelope on each tray table, with a polite nod and smile. The other passengers glanced at them, intrigued, some laughing softly, treating it like a novelty. Another perk of luxury air travel. Yvette, now seated a full section away, watched as the attendant approached her row, paused, then reached into her bag and pulled a red envelope, different from the white ones given to everyone else. She placed it on Yvette's tray without a word, turned, and walked away. The envelope was marked with a thick black label across the top. Additional identity confirmation required non-standard profile review. Beneath it, in smaller print, for the safety of our passengers and staff, select passengers may be required to undergo secondary confirmation procedures. Yvette didn't open it. She didn't need to. The message wasn't inside. The message was the envelope itself. She was no longer being ignored. She was being singled out in full view, marked, labeled, processed like a security risk, while others sipped cocktails and watched rom-coms. She turned the envelope over. Her name was printed in small, bold type on the sticker seal. They wanted her to see it. They wanted her to know. This was no longer a passive campaign of exclusion. This was active, deliberate humiliation. She slipped the envelope into her coat pocket without breaking her posture. Her gaze lifted slightly. 2 rows ahead, a man in a blazer glanced back, curious. She didn't give him the satisfaction of reaction. Her face remained neutral, composed. But her stomach had begun to knot. They weren't just isolating her. They were staging her, framing her discomfort as justification for their control. A few minutes later, as she stared out the window into the endless dark, the plane jolted slightly. Mild turbulence. Nothing serious. Just a short shake, the kind that barely registers after hours in the air. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and the cabin settled again. But above Yvette's head, there was a faint mechanical sound, followed by a sudden snap. An oxygen mask dropped directly into her lap. Only hers. Nowhere else in the cabin did a mask deploy. Not one. Passengers around her stirred slightly, confused. A few glanced over. One man looked up to check if his own mask had fallen, then shrugged and looked away. Yvette stared at the dangling mask for a long, quiet moment. It swung gently, left to right, brushing her shoulder. Her eyes never left it. Within seconds, a flight attendant approached. Not quickly, not with urgency. Calm, rehearsed, slow. Just a minor tech hiccup, she said, eyes scanning Yvette without warmth. No cause for concern. She didn't offer to retract the mask. She didn't apologize. She simply turned and walked away. Yvette let the mask hang. She made no move to touch it. The message was clear. She was the malfunction. She was the anomaly. The optics were perfect. One mask, one warning, one person. She sat there for several minutes, the mask resting in her lap like an accusation, the red envelope still in her coat, her tray bare, her screen black. The crew passed by again, this time with chocolates and mints for premium passengers. The cart skipped a row. Again, no one spoke to her. No one offered explanation. Every single person on the crew had committed fully to the role. This was theater now. And Yvette was no longer just being excluded. She was being cast as a character in their silent performance, the kind whose discomfort was both ignored and amplified for spectacle. She was a disturbance dressed in tailored clothes, a threat disguised as a professional woman, a ghost they had decided to haunt while smiling. And still she did not react, not visibly, not verbally. She allowed the oxygen mask to swing gently until the cabin's airflow slowly rocked it to stillness. It hung like a noose above her, soft and sterile and surreal. They had worked so hard to erase her that they had, without realizing it, drawn all attention to the space they left behind. The absence they created around her had become louder than her presence ever was. But now, the narrative was beginning to fracture. The script they had written, one of subtle exclusion, silent condemnation, and humiliating control, was about to be interrupted. She felt it. Not hope, not yet, but inevitability. The air shifted as she slowly stood from her cramped seat. Her knees cracked softly. Her legs protested from hours of tension, but she moved with the same quiet dignity she had maintained from the moment she was stopped at the gate. A stretch, nothing more. A brief walk down the aisle. No announcement, no confrontation, just a need to move, to breathe. And then the voice came. "Ms. Yvette Monroe, please make your way to the front of the cabin for final confirmation. I repeat, Ms. Yvette Monroe, please report to the cockpit." The intercom clicked off. The words floated in the stale cabin air like smoke. Silence followed. Absolute loaded silence. Then, gradually, the ripple began. Heads turned, eyes lifted, brows furrowed. The man across the aisle leaned back to glance at her more fully. A woman 2 rows up tilted her phone, subtly recording. Whispered questions began trailing her name down the corridor of overhead bins and reclined seats. Who was she? What had she done? Why would the captain need to speak to a passenger during flight? Yvette didn't flinch. She simply turned toward the front of the plane, her scarf hanging loose now, her expression composed, though something burned behind her gaze. Her steps were slow, deliberate. Every eye she passed became a weight, but she carried them all. She was used to it. When she reached the velvet curtain separating business from first class, the head flight attendant emerged from behind it. She stood in the center of the aisle, blocking the path, her body language coiled, hands clasped behind her back in military precision. Her lips were pressed into a practiced line. Yvette met her eyes. No words were exchanged at first, just tension, taut, brittle, crackling between them. The attendant opened her mouth, likely prepared to repeat the performance, to issue another hollow instruction, another cold reminder that Yvette did not belong where she was going. Her eyes, pale and precise, scanned Yvette's face. There was a moment of confusion, then disbelief, then something else entirely. Recognition. The kind of recognition that overrides training, bypasses arrogance, and punches straight through a person's delusions of control. A muscle in her jaw shifted. Her spine, once rigid, seemed to loosen. Slowly, as if forced by something far greater than protocol, she stepped aside. No explanation, no apology, no attempt to smooth it over. She simply moved, eyes lowered now, her entire posture changed, not submissive, not shaken, but undeniably aware that she had just miscalculated something irreversible. Each step she took forward was an unraveling of the narrative they had built around her. This woman they had labeled a threat. This woman they had stripped of service, of space, of basic respect. This woman was now moving past their barriers without resistance, not with a raised voice, not with a confrontation, but with a presence that no longer asked for acknowledgement. It demanded it. The curtain swished behind her. A new stillness followed. Somewhere a baby cried faintly from economy. Someone sipped a drink, suddenly unsure whether the comfort they had been offered was built on the discomfort of others. The moment hung, suspended in the cabin air. Yvette stood now just a few steps from the cockpit door. The lead steward there, tall and square-shouldered, turned and spoke into a discreet radio clipped to his belt. Then he looked at her. This time, his gaze held none of the practiced indifference she had been shown before. His lips parted slightly. "Ms. Monroe," he said quietly. And though the words were plain, they carried something different. Awareness, gravity, and beneath that, fear. Before she could respond, he tapped once on the cockpit door. A voice responded through the panel, this time not amplified by speakers. A short exchange. Then the door cracked open. A pilot's face appeared, lined, stern, a professional who looked like he hadn't smiled in a decade. His eyes landed on her. For one long second, they didn't move. She didn't enter. Not yet. She didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. She had walked a corridor built to break her and reached the end of it without cracking. And now, those who had sought to diminish her were scrambling to rewrite the rules. She stood there as they recalibrated their narrative, trying to find a version of events that didn't make them look like fools. Trying to remember if they had heard her name before, and now suddenly realizing they had. Something had shifted, a fracture in the carefully constructed facade of exclusion and disregard. She had crossed a line, not with anger or confrontation, but with quiet assertion of a truth that could no longer be denied. As the plane approached its destination, the subtle machinery behind the scenes began to hum to life. Beneath the seat cushion where Yvette had been forced to sit, a small, almost imperceptible light blinked. A discreet RFID sensor, part of the airline's internal security network, had been programmed to detect federal inspectors embedded on flights for covert monitoring. The node pulsed red, an alert flashing silently within the plane's secure systems. The lead flight attendant, who had once looked through Yvette as if she were air, glanced at her seat and paled visibly. A knot tightened in her stomach as she realized that the woman they had worked so hard to isolate was not just any passenger. She was someone whose authority extended beyond the airline's own hierarchy. The implications raced through the crew like wildfire. Yvette sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, unaware of the subtle panic that now gripped the staff. Behind closed doors, managers whispered hurriedly over encrypted radios. Orders were relayed quickly to the cockpit and ground control. No one dared look Yvette in the eye anymore. The power dynamic had inverted without a word spoken. The cabin door that usually opened wide to welcome passengers after landing stayed firmly shut. Instead, a separate stair truck was positioned to the side of the aircraft, marked clearly with the words "Gov Clearance Only" in bold white letters on a stark black background. The usual rush of passengers waiting to disembark was held back by security personnel who cordoned off the area. Yvette was the only passenger allowed to step down the private staircase, escorted by two stern-looking officials in dark suits and earpieces. As she descended onto the tarmac, the glare of floodlights cast long shadows behind her. Reporters and crew stood back, murmuring quietly, their curiosity tempered by the unmistakable aura of officialdom that surrounded her. The ordinary passengers had no idea what was happening just beyond the curtain of routine deplaning procedures. The ground crew carefully closed the main boarding ramp, ensuring that no other passengers could access the primary exit. Behind Yvette, the plane's engines cooled slowly, the hum fading as the last signals of power fed the onboard systems. Yvette moved forward with steady, measured steps, her face composed, her posture resolute. She was the single point of clarity in a sea of controlled chaos. Her role was no longer one of silent victim or excluded passenger. It had transformed into that of an agent of accountability, a quiet but powerful force demanding change. Inside the private vehicle, waiting to whisk her away, a briefing was already underway, a secure conversation about the next steps in the investigation that Yvette had been conducting in plain sight. The hidden power she carried was not just her own resilience, but the authority granted by her position in the Federal Aviation Administration. It was a position that made the airline's attempts at subterfuge irrelevant. The game had changed, and the rules were no longer theirs to write. On the tarmac, the city lights shimmered beyond the fence line. Yvette's eyes caught the horizon, and for the first time in hours, she allowed herself a brief moment of calm. The flight had been a gauntlet, a trial not just of endurance, but of systemic injustice. The airline's headquarters was thrown into immediate crisis mode. Calls cascaded from the Federal Aviation Administration demanding urgent explanations. Internal emails flagged the flight crew involved as subjects of a formal investigation. The first to feel the repercussions were the senior flight attendants who had orchestrated Yvette's isolation, her humiliation, her reassignment. They found themselves suspended without pay within the hour, barred from flying or working until the inquiry was completed. The entire in-flight team on that particular flight was removed from duty pending further review. The FAA's statement cited multiple Class 2 ethical violations, a category reserved for serious misconduct that endangered passenger welfare and violated federal regulations. More damningly, the charges specified racially motivated service protocols, explicitly calling out discriminatory practices that had compromised the integrity of the airline's commitment to equality and safety. In the following hours, federal investigators combed through the flight's security footage with meticulous care. Every camera angle, every corridor, every seatback monitor's recording was reviewed frame by frame. The video revealed not just moments of overt exclusion, but the subtle choreography of exclusion that had been carefully engineered and executed by the crew. The images showed Yvette's silent endurance, the denial of basic services, the forced movement from her assigned seat, the suspicious disappearance of personal items, the passing over of call buttons and requests, the whispered exchanges between crew members, the placement of incriminating notes. Each clip was cataloged, time-stamped, and annotated with expert analysis of behavioral patterns indicating racial bias and abuse of authority. This comprehensive archive was compiled into a formal report submitted to the Department of Transportation. The file was aptly named Monroe Incident, Embedded Behavioral Audit Case Documentation. It was intended not only as evidence for the ongoing investigation, but as a national training tool for airlines and regulatory bodies alike, a testament to the perils of unchecked discrimination within the skies. The airline's reputation took an immediate hit. Social media erupted as snippets of the incident, carefully vetted and verified, circulated rapidly. Public outcry demanded accountability. Advocacy groups seized the moment to call for systemic reform in airline service standards and anti-discrimination enforcement. Within the company, executives scrambled to contain the damage. Internal meetings convened with legal teams, PR consultants, and compliance officers. Damage control strategies were debated and deployed, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The flight crew had ignored Yvette's calls for assistance, who had belittled and humiliated her, who had moved her seat and confiscated her belongings, could no longer hide behind scripted responses or corporate doublespeak. Their actions had been documented, exposed, and condemned on a scale that reverberated far beyond the cabin. Meanwhile, Yvette herself became a reluctant symbol. Media outlets sought interviews, lawmakers requested testimony, and fellow passengers offered statements corroborating the pattern of abuse. Through it all, she remained composed, a pillar of grace amid the storm. The investigation promised sweeping changes, not just for the airline in question, but for the industry as a whole. Regulatory bodies pledged to implement stricter oversight, mandating new training protocols emphasizing empathy, equity, and cultural competence. Airlines were ordered to reassess their internal reporting mechanisms to better detect and address discrimination before it could escalate. And for those who had perpetrated or allowed such behavior, the consequences were severe and immediate. Job terminations followed suspensions. Licenses and certifications were reviewed. Careers were irreversibly altered. The Monroe incident became a case study taught in aviation schools, diversity workshops, and corporate ethics training programs nationwide. It forced a reckoning within the aviation community, highlighting the need to transform the culture of power and privilege that too often enabled systemic bias. As the dust settled, the airline announced a public apology and committed to a comprehensive overhaul of its customer service policies. A new advisory board was formed, including representatives from civil rights organizations and passenger advocacy groups. The CEO publicly acknowledged the failures exposed by Yvette's experience and vowed to restore trust through transparency and action. The room was thick with anticipation as the congressional chamber filled with lawmakers, advocates, media representatives, and airline executives. The massive screens lining the walls flickered to life, displaying moments from Yvette Monroe's harrowing flight, clips of silent exclusion, deliberate omission, forced relocation, and coded acts of humiliation. Yvette sat at the witness table, composed in a tailored suit that bore none of the fatigue that had shadowed her on the plane. Her eyes were steady and focused, reflecting the weight of responsibility she carried. When her turn came to speak, she rose with measured grace and approached the microphone. The room fell silent, every ear attuned to her voice, which was calm but unwavering. She spoke not of vengeance, but of accountability, not of pain, but of purpose. Each word was precise, backed by evidence, by experience, by a truth that no denial could dismantle. She detailed the mechanisms of discrimination she had endured, The systemic layering of microaggressions that became overt acts, the complicity embedded in silence, the courage required to document what others chose to ignore. She illustrated how unchecked bias compromised passenger safety and violated the fundamental dignity owed to every traveler. Her testimony was supported by data, by the detailed audit compiled from that flight and others, revealing a pattern too widespread to dismiss. Lawmakers asked probing questions, seeking clarity, seeking solutions. But the answers lay in Yvette's poised articulation of what justice required: transparency, education, and enforceable standards. After hours of discussion, the panel voted unanimously to propose sweeping new legislation. The Airline Passenger Equity and Oversight Act mandated that all commercial airlines implement anonymous, unannounced audits by federal inspectors who could board as any passenger, carry out covert investigations, and report violations without fear of retaliation. It required airlines to overhaul their training programs, incorporating mandatory education on implicit bias and inclusive service practices. It stipulated the establishment of independent oversight committees with community representation to ensure accountability beyond corporate interests. The media buzzed. Headlines celebrated a landmark moment in consumer rights and civil liberties, highlighting Yvette's courage and the law's potential to reshape an industry long resistant to change. Airlines scrambled to adjust policies, many issuing public statements pledging renewed commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. More importantly, travelers began to understand that the skies, long viewed as a bastion of privilege, could now be a place of vigilance, where anyone might be the eyes and ears of justice. Yvette herself became a reluctant icon, invited to speak at conferences, universities, and policy forums. She never sought the spotlight, but she used it with deliberate intention to educate, to inspire, to advocate for those still silenced by systems of exclusion. Her journey had started as a solitary act of endurance, but it culminated in a collective call to conscience, a reminder that progress demands not just awareness, but action. The final scene unfolded not in a courtroom or legislative chamber, but in countless everyday moments. Passengers sitting side by side, aware that their fellow travelers might be watching, assessing, demanding respect. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with more powerful narratives that challenge injustice. I'd love to know what you think. Did the plot resonate with you? Were there moments that surprised you or made you reflect? Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts and telling me where you're watching from. Your voice matters, and I'm excited to hear from you.